Okay, our learning is Lila Nishmas Mindel, Mariam Bas Kalman Ruvin, her Neshama Shav and Aliyah. We are at Chav Dalet Amud Aleph, 4 lines down by the 2 dots. Here we go. Ibailahu, there's a question asked. Mala Hasker Shel Chanukah Birkas Hamazon. Should we mention Chanukah during benching? Now, this is a cool question. I think this whole next Gemara is pretty wild because, as we'll see, there's going to be a whole bunch of opinions about things that we all take for granted. Meaning, do you mention Chanukah during Birkas Hamazon?
Of course.
Of course, supposed to, right? Do you mention Yalav Yav on Rosh Chodesh? Of course. Do you say Anenu on a Tainus? Of course, right? But in the times of the Gemara, which is 1,500 years ago or so, they didn't have all these things clarified. In other words, things take time to develop. We sometimes imagine, everything was just boom, it was all there. But what this Gemara, we're gonna see a whole bunch of opinions, and ultimately the Gemara is going to reject all of them and really come out with the way that, more or less the way that we practice today. But it's just, we're watching as some of the customs developed, meaning institutions like Yalav Yavo and Alanisim were later institutions. Even within the context of Tefillah, they're later institutions. And so the exact parameters, like when do you say, when do you not say it, what words do you add over here, it's not yet developed when we see this. And it's unique because lots of times when we go through Gemara, it's already, okay, this is something already established, and here we're watching the development. I don't know. I find that interesting, just like from a historical perspective, just to kind of come in before it's fully established, but that's essentially what we're doing. So, Ibailahu, Mala Hasker Shel Chanukah Birkas Hamazon. Should a person mention Chanukah during benching, during Birkas Hamazon? Kivan D'Rabbanan Hula Midkarinan. Do we say that since Chanukah is something which is Midrabbanan, therefore there's no need to mention? Or do we say that because it's Pirsumei Nisa, because of this importance of publicizing the miracle, therefore we do mention it even there? Now, there's no question. The Gemara never questions, do we say Alanisim during davening? That was a given. And the Mefarshim explained, during davening, the whole idea of davening is we are praising God. I mean, Birkas Hamazon is a very limited, specific praise of praising God for food. But davening, Shemona Esrei, it's all, Modim and Achim Lach is a fundamental part. And the holiday of Chanukah was established, the Hodos Ulahalel, to thank Hashem. So it's pashut, it's obvious that you're going to say Alanisim during Birkas Hamazon, during Tefillah. But during Birkas Hamazon, here's the question. Do we say, since it's rabbinic, they didn't add it? Or do we say, no, Chanukah is so important, the idea of Pirsumei Nisa, therefore it is mentioned? So Amar Rava, Amar Rav Schora, Amar Rav Huna, Eino Masker. First opinion says we don't mention it. Okay, I'm sorry. The only opinion says we don't mention it. Vim bala hasker masker b'hodzah. But if a person wants to mention it, it should be mentioned during hodzah. What does hodzah mean? In middle of nodelecha, and that's what we do. So it's interesting. The way the Gemara really leaves off over here is saying that there's no obligation to say it. The later the Rishonim points out that eventually a custom develops that we do say it, right? But when the Gemara is concluding, it basically says you don't have to. If you want to, you could. And now the halacha is you do say it. Now, practically speaking, there is a if a person forgets Alanisim, you do not have to go back in benching. Whereas for other things, we'll see, if you forget Ritzei during Friday night davening, Friday night's benching or Shabbos day benching, you do have to go back and say Ritzei. When it comes to Alanisim, if you skip it, you don't have to go back. There is, if you look in the Siddur, there is one place you can kind of go back and say it. But the bottom line is, based on the Gemara, you don't have to say it. It wasn't instituted. Minhag eventually developed that we do. Yes, next.
Pirsum Manisa is a strange thing to say for Birkat Hamazon because you're not publicizing it.
Yeah. Very good. So the question was Pirsumei Nisa. Does that really relate to benching? And some actually point out that's part of the question. In other words, for davening, which is done in a public setting, there we understand Pirsumei Nisa would apply. Birkas Hamazon, because it's private, do we say there still is an element of Pirsumei Nisa? It's almost like the premise of the question is exactly that. It's saying, is there an element of Pirsumei Nisa even though it's in the privacy of your home? Now, and that is exactly the premise of the question. So, really, your question is really the way the Gemara is asking. Okay, Rav Huna bar Yehuda ikla levei Rava. Rav Huna, the son of Yehuda, went to visit Rava's Rava's base medrash. Savar Kure b'Bon Yerushalayim. He wanted to say Alanisim in Bon Yerushalayim, meaning the same place that we normally say Yalav Yavo and Ritzei. He wants to put Alanisim in that place. Amar lahu Rav Shesha. Rav Shesha said Kitzfila. No. When it comes to Alani, it all is parallel. It's based on the structure of Tefillah. Ma Tefillah b'Hodah, just like in davening in Shemona Esrei, we say Alanisim in the Tefillah of Modim Anachnu Lach. Birkas Hamazon behodah. Similarly, in Birkas Hamazon, we don't say it in Rachem Na, which is where we say Yalav Yav and Ritzei. Rather, we say it in the bracha of Hodah, i.e., No Delecha. Okay, so again, if you now the question, why do we say Alanisim in No Delecha, whereas the other extra tefillos we say in middle of Rachem? The reason is that we make it's paralleled, it copies what we do for davening, for tefillah, and that's why we put it in No Delecha, just like we say Alanisim in Modim. Okay. Ibailuhu, question. Ma lahas Rosh Chodesh Birkas Hamazon. Should a person mention Rosh Chodesh in Birkas Hamazon? Now again, you and I know the answer. Yes, you do. But the Gemara did not. It wasn't yet fully established. Imtim Tzlomer, if you want to say B'Chanukah D'Rabbanan Lo Tzarech. That Chanukah is rabbinic. and therefore you don't have to say Al Nisim, right? Again, the Gemara is going with the premise that it just concluded with, that you don't say Al Nisim during benching. So maybe the reason you don't say Al Nisim is because it's rabbinic, and therefore Rosh Chodesh D'Oraisa Tzarech, Rosh Chodesh, which is a biblical institution, you would, meaning Rosh Chodesh is from the Torah, you would have to say it. Or do we say that since on Rosh Chodesh, similar to Chanukah, there's no prohibition against work, therefore it should not be mentioned during we don't say Yal V'Yavo during benching, as opposed to, let's say, Ritzei, as opposed to Yal V'Yavo for other Yom Tovim. Again, that is the question. Worth mentioning parenthetically, there is a Gemara in Megillah which talks about an Isser Malacha. It says you should not be doing work on Rosh Chodesh. The Mefarshim explain that it's a minhag that people have, and specifically a minhag for women not to do malacha. It's not, not everyone has this minhag. So when we say there is no Isser Asiyas Malacha, it's true there's no prohibition, but there is a minhag. There was, and certainly at certain times it was much more well established that women would not do malacha. But bottom line is it's certainly not prohibited to do malacha on Rosh Chodesh. So what's the halacha? Rav Amar Maskir. Rav says you do say Yal V'Yavo in Berkas Hamazon. Rav Chanina Amar Eino Maskir. Rav Chanina says you do not say Yal V'Yavo in Berkas Hamazon. Amar Rav Zreika. We're going to bring a proof, or try to bring a proof to Rav, who said that you do say Yal V'Yavo in Berkas Hamazon. Nikot Rab Yadcha. Hold on to Rav, and in your hand. Dekar Rabbi Oshia Kavasa, because Rav Oshia, an earlier Tana, goes like Rav. Or Rav really goes like him. The Tani Rav Oshia taught in a brisa. Yamim sheyesh b'hem karma musaf, days which you bring musaf. Kigon Rosh Chodesh v'chul Amud. So Rosh Chodesh and Chol Hamoed, Arvis Shacharis u'Mincha mispal Shmona Esrei, all the different Shmona Esreis. Va'omer me'ein ha'ma'ora ba'avoda. Okay, and you say Rosh Chodesh in the section of avoda, meaning in the bracha of ritzei. Okay. Fine, so far so good, right? We know that, right? You say Yal V'Yavo, any day that you would bring a karban musaf, which any day you have a musaf. So for example, Rosh Chodesh, Chol Hamoed, those are days that a musaf offering was brought. You would say Yal V'Yavo and include it in the bracha of avoda, i.e. the bracha of ritzei. Vimlo Amar, Machzir Noso. And if you do not say it, you go back. In other words, if you forget Yal V'Yavo on Chol Hamoed or on Rosh Chodesh, you have to go back. Ve'ein behem kiddush alakos, okay, and you don't say kiddush on those days, right? You don't say kiddush on Rosh Chodesh, you don't say kiddush on Chol Hamoed. V'yesh ben haskara beberkas hamazon, okay, and you do mention the particular day, meaning Rosh Chodesh or Chol Hamoed, in benching, right? So why did we just bring this brisa? Because that's exactly what Rav said. Rav, the question was, do you say Yal V'Yavo on Rosh Chodesh? And we see from this brisa, you do say Yal V'Yavo on Rosh Chodesh, okay? Good, that's the proof. Let's just go back just one point. They mention over here in this brisa that if you forget Yal V'Yavo during Shemona Esrei, you have to go back. There's one exception to that. There's one time that if you skipped Yal V'Yavo, you don't have to go back. What is that? Mariv on Rosh Chodesh, right? On Rosh Chodesh during the day, Shachris and Mincha, you do have to go back. But if you forget Yal V'Yavo and Mariv, you do not have to go back. Why is that? Not because it's Derabanan, Rosh Chodesh is Deraisa. And that would not be distinguished between Shachris and, you're saying because Mariv is Derabanan. But Chol Hamoed, you would have to go back. Right? So they say that the reason that's brought down in other Gemara is the fact that since you cannot establish the new moon during the evening, all the establishment of the moon has to take place during the day. Therefore, therefore Rosh Chodesh is disassociated the evening in some way, and therefore, if you miss it in the evening, you do not go back. If you miss Rosh Chodesh, Shachris, and Mincha, you would have to go back. Okay, fine. But on Chol Hamoed, if you miss it in Mariv, even though Mariv is Derabanan or less than maybe, you still would have to go back. It's only Rosh Chodesh. Okay, fine. Bottom line is we brought a proof to Rav, and that's the way we paskin, that you do mention Rosh Chodesh in Berkas Hamazon. Okay, fine. The brisa continues, and we're going to unpack that as well. Yamim she'ein bahem karban musaf, days which we do not have a musaf. Kigon sheni v'chamishi v'tainus ma'amados. For example, Mondays and Thursdays, fast days, and ma'amados. What are ma'amados? Ma'amados are as follows. Back in the day, when the Beis Hamikdash stood, all the Jewish people would be broken up into groups. In other words, and what would happen is different groups would go to the Beis Hamikdash and help the Kohanim on that day. There was one day a year that a group of non-Kohanim would go to the Beis Hamikdash to assist the Kohanim, and they would, by assist, I don't even mean they would actually physically help them. They would be there, they would daven, they would say special tefillos, and the idea is that they would represent the rest of Jewish people during that day. In other words, the Kohanim were not our only representatives in the Beis Hamikdash. The non-Kohanim amongst us would actually go to the Beis Hamikdash once a year as a representation of the rest of the Jewish people and lead certain tefillos. They would fast on that day. It was like a special day for those people. Okay, and that way each person had a connection to the Beis Hamikdash through these ma'amados. Now the Gemara interjects this brisa and says, "Wait, sheni v'chamishi mai v'tayu. Why are we talking about Mondays and Thursdays? Like, what is special about Mondays and Thursdays? Ella sheni v'chamishi v'sheni shel tainis u'ma'amados. We're talking about specific Mondays of fast days. Okay, so if you learn Maseches Tainis, sorry.
This is the Mahavta
Yeah, Bahab, or basically whenever there's an institution of fast. It's not referring to Bahab, but Bahab is based on this. In other words, if you look in the Gemara in Tainus, when there was no rain in Israel, which unfortunately would happen a lot, they would institute at certain junctures, after enough time that there was no rain, they would institute fast days. And the fast days would be Monday, everyone would fast, Thursday, everyone would fast, and Monday, everyone would fast. So that's the Monday, Thursday, Monday that we're mentioning. On those days, Arvis, B'Shachar, Zumincha, Mispal, Shmona Esrei, evening, morning, and afternoon during Shemona Esrei, v'omer me'ina ma'ora b'shomei tefillah. And they would say me'ina ma'ora means like the thing that reflects the occasion during Shemei tefillah. What is he referring to? What would you mention? There's a tefillah called anenu. It's a tefillah that we say during fast days, and this was said, so when they would fast Monday, Thursday, Monday, or the ma'amados who would also be fasting, they would say, or any fast day in general, they would say anenu during Shemei tefillah, v'imlo amar emachzir so. If it was not said, you don't go back. Okay, ve'em they take that, put that in parentheses because obviously there's no kiddush. Ve'ein behen atzkar berkas hamazon, and you don't make any mention of the fast day during benching. Now, obviously, you wouldn't make a mention of a fast day during benching. What's it referring to? Two options. One would be someone who's eating on that day, but that's not what it's referring to. What it's referring to is the night before. All these fast days are daytime fast days. So think about it. Meaning, let's say Shabbat Bar is a very special day, right? You would say, today we talk about the destruction of the Mikdash. Maybe I should make mention the night before, if I bench, I should make mention of the fast day. The answer is no, we don't make any mention during Birkas Hamazon for these things. But we do say Anenu during Shemei Tefillah. Now it's interesting. We don't pass this way either, right? Because when do we say Anenu? Only mincha, right? The Chazan says it during Shacharis, but the rest of the congregation only says anenu on a fast day during mincha time. Why is that? So the poskim bring down the reason that's developed is because it talks about a person. If you look at the text of anenu, it speaks in the first person of someone who's fasting. I'm in pain. I'm in, and now we're in pain. Now, if you're not fasting, it's a problem. So if you start the day, now it's possible, person, you start the fast and you don't always make it to the end. Things can come up. So it'd be disingenuous to go ahead and say, God, I'm in so much pain. Yeah, shkoyach, you skip breakfast. Like big deal, okay? And then by lunchtime, you already broke the fast. But mincha time, at the end of the day, you're in pain, you're going to make it. We're assuming you're going to make it. And therefore, we only say to mincha because at that point, we can be confident the person's going to continue fasting. Okay, fine. But again, it's one of these gemaras. It's so fascinating. We just learned to halacha. It's not what we do because that's not it changed. Okay. Ibailahu, question. Should a person mention Chanukah in Musaf davening? In other words, on Chanukah and Rosh Chodesh always coincide, and Shabbos and Chanukah always coincide, and therefore the question is, during the Musaf tefillah, do you say Rosh Chodesh? And says the Gemara to explain the question. Do you say that since Chanukah itself doesn't trigger a Musaf, in other words, there's no Musaf offering of Chanukah, therefore we don't mention Chanukah in the Musaf davening? Oh, Dilma Yom Hu Shechai Bar Batfilah. So we say no. At the end of the day, Chanukah is on this day of Rosh Chodesh, or Chanukah is on this day of Shabbos, and Shabbos is the day you daven for tefillos, and therefore you should say Chanukah in each of these tefillos. So the Gemara tries to answer. The Gemara says, Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, Amri Tarvayu, Eino Maskir. First two opinions says you don't say it. Rav Nachman, Rav Yochanan, Amri Tarvayu, Maskir. They say you do say it. Okay, so Machlokas, some say you do say Alanisim during Musaf davening, and some say you do not. Amar Rabbi Rav Yosef, Had Rav Huna, Rav Yehuda, de Rav Hu. The opinion of Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda is consistent with the opinion of Rav. Okay, they're the ones who say, by the way, you don't say it. Okay, and they're going to try to bring a proof from Rav. What is that? Rav Gidal Rav. Rosh Chodesh Cholios b'Shabbos. Let's say Rosh Chodesh is the same day of Shabbos. Hamafter benavi b'Shabbos, a person who, when you say the Haftorah, Eino tzarich lahaskir Rosh Chodesh. You don't have to mention Rosh Chodesh at all in the Haftorah. Shel Mali Shabbos einavi Rosh Chodesh, because if it wouldn't be Shabbos, there would not be. You would not be saying a Navi, you would not be saying Haftarah on Rosh Chodesh, right? So what's he saying? What he's saying is as follows: Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, right? Comes up all the time. So when you say the Haftarah is always going to reflect the day. So for example, on Yom Tiv, you're going to say a Yom Tiv related Haftarah. So Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, do you have to mention Rosh Chodesh in the Haftarah or not? Okay? So he's saying you do not. Why don't you? Because it's true it's Rosh Chodesh. But if it would just be Rosh Chodesh, meaning if Rosh Chodesh fell on a Monday, there's no Haftarah. And since there be no Haftarah, you wouldn't be saying anything about Rosh Chodesh, and therefore, in the regular Haftarah, you do not have to mention Rosh Chodesh at all. How does this relate to us? Similarly, since there's no Karban Musaf, on Chanukah, regular day of Chanukah, there'd be no Karban Musaf, right? And therefore, on its own, there'd be no Karban Musaf. Therefore, you shouldn't have to mention Chanukah. That's the parallel over here, basically saying just like Rosh Chodesh, you do not Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, you don't mention Rosh Chodesh in the Haftarah. Similarly, Musaf on Chanukah, you don't mention Chanukah in the Musaf davening. Ask the Gemara, Midami, what kind of comparison is that? Hasam Navi Rosh Chodesh Leika Klau. There is no concept of saying Haftarah on Rosh Chodesh. Hacha Isav Arvis Shachris Mincha. Here, Alanisim is included in all the tefillos of that day. and therefore, why not include it in Musaf? In other words, it's not a perfect parallel, and therefore you can't bring a proof from there. Elo hadamya, rather say like this. Damar Rav, a proof to Rav from here. Damar Rav achav dvai, Amar Rav masna Rav. Yom Tov shechol yos b'Shabbos. If Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, okay, so whenever you have Yom Tov and Shabbos on the same day, hamafter benavi b'mincha b'Shabbos in a tzarich lahaskir shel Yom Tov. When you say the haftorah and mincha, you don't have to mention Yom Tov. Okay, Shalmali Shabbos enav mincha Yom Tov, because if it wouldn't be Shabbos, you wouldn't be reading a navi and mincha on Yom Tov. Now let's pause for a second. Do we say haftorah and mincha? No, we do not. Okay, so what's going on over here? So Rashi brings from the Gaonim that there was actually a custom for a while that they would actually say Haftorah. They would say a short Haftorah and Mincha on Shabbos afternoons. We eventually stopped it, but they stopped it. It seems like there's the Persians stopped, prevented us from doing so. But the bottom line is that such a minhag existed. They would say it. So fine. So it was done. So what? So again, what's the proof? The proof is that Mincha of Shabbos Yom Tov. You do not have to mention Yom Tov on that during that laning of Haftorah. Why? Because if it wouldn't be Shabbos, you would not be reading the Torah reading. So now we're going to say similarly over here, Rosh Chodesh that falls out, you would not. Rosh Chodesh that falls out on Chanukah, you should not say Ya'aleh V'yavo during the Rosh Chodesh davening, just like you don't have to talk about Yom Tov on during the Haftorah. Okay? Yeah? Says the Gemara further. V'lei selchasa kechol hanishmaitza. Excuse me. Okay. The halacha is not like all of the teachings that we saw above, or at least some of the teachings that we saw above. Here is the halacha. Yom Kippur, which falls on Shabbos. Okay, it's Yom Kippur and Shabbos. Hamispala ni'ila tzarich lahaskir shel Shabbos. And ni'ila, you have to mention shel Shabbos as well. What's the chiddush? The chiddush is that during Shachris, Mincha, Musaf, those are all things you would say on Shabbos anyways. Ni'ila is something you don't say on Shabbos. Nonetheless, if Shabbos and Yom Kippur fall on the same day, you do mention Shabbos at Ni'ila. Okay, Yom Hu Shenischai Bar B'Tfilos, because we say it's a day that you are obligated in Tfilos, and therefore, even if that's a Tfilah that wouldn't otherwise be said, still you would add the extra thing. So again, what does that mean practically for us? What that means is, anytime you have, so again, Shabbos and Yom Kippur, you mention Shabbos at Ni'ilah. Ya'aleh V'yavo, not Ya'aleh V'yavo, Al Hanisim, on Chanukah, even though Chanukah itself does not necessitate Musaf, but you would still add Al Hanisim in the Musaf davening, and that is our minhag. That's what we do. Yeah? Make sense? Yeah? Okay. Before we conclude, we have a contradiction in halachos, because Amras Hilchsa Kirav Yeshua ben Levi, V'kaimal Hilchsa Kirava. You just said the halacha is like Rav Yeshua ben Levi, who said you do say Al Hanisim in Musaf, and yet we know normally the halacha is like Rava, and Rava says different. Rava says, Damar Rava, Yom Tov Shechol Yos B'Shabbos, if Yom Tov falls out on Shabbos, Shliach Tzibur Hayor L'fnei HaTeva Arvis, then the Chazan during Mariv Eino Tzarich Lahaskir Shel Yom Tov doesn't have to mention Yom Tov. Okay, Shel Mali Shabbos Ein Shlech Tzira Yodea Yored Arvis B'Yom Tov, because if it wouldn't be Shabbos, there'd be no Chazan for Mariv on Yom Tov. What is he talking about over here? What do you mean? We always have a Chazan. So what they're referring to is a tefillah that's said at the end of davening. There's a tefillah that's said at the end of davening on Shabbos specifically, which is Magen Avos, that whole tefillah. That's all added on, right? If you look right after Mariv on Shemona Esrei Mariv, we say Vayichulu. And then we say a whole tefillah, right? That tefillah, if you look at the text, is an abridged version of Shemona Esrei. It's really a repetition of Shemona Esrei, and it's a short version of Shemona Esrei. It's essentially Chazar Sashatz at Mariv. It's only done on Shabbos, okay? It's only done, by the way, if you're in a congregation, which we'll come back to in a moment. So people davening at home don't say this, or people davening. I was at a hotel the Shabbos. We didn't say it because it's not in a shul. It was dafkas in a shul. We'll come back to why in a second, because it's very relevant to our discussion. But what's the proof? The proof is that, let's say it's Shabbos Yom Tov, okay? So Sukkos and Shabbos fall out together, okay? So in that tefillah that said after Shemona Esrei, you don't mention Yom Tov there, right? So you see that when something is added on that you wouldn't otherwise say, you don't mention the Yom Tov. So similarly, it should be for Musaf, you shouldn't add Al Hanisim. You read around the parallel, right? Just like on Shabbos and Yom Tov, you don't, in that tefillah that said after Shemona Esrei, the repetition, you don't mention Yom Tov, because if it would just be Yom Tov, you don't say that tefillah, right? So similarly on Shabbos, similarly on Rosh Chodesh of Chanukah, you shouldn't mention Ya'aleh V'yavo, Al Hanisim during Musaf. So the Gemara says no, there's no proof from there. Hachiyashta, okay? Is that so? Hasam b'dinhu dafilu b'Shabbos nami lo tzarich. He says, when it comes to that repetition, even on Shabbos, it should not be said, V'Rabbanan hu tztakune mishum sakana. The entire institution of that tefillah was said because of danger. Aval hacha yom hu shenischai bar batfilos. The day itself, again, the day itself, whether it's Shabbos falling out on Rosh Chodesh, Shabbos falling out on Yom Kippur, or it's Rosh Chodesh falling out on Yom Kippur, the day itself is a day that necessitates extra tefillos, and therefore it's no comparison to this specific tefillah that's said at the end of Shemona Esrei. Don't bring me a proof from something which is not really an obligation. What does he mean by that? So let's understand where this tefillah comes from. Why do they institute? What does he mean that you institute it for danger? There is a tefillah. Let's before we come back to here. There's a tefillah in Mariv that is said. Okay, that you don't say, that people in Israel don't say, and that's Baruch Hashem La'olam, right? After you say Baruch Hashem Shemer Yisrael La'ad, there's a tefillah Baruch Hashem La'olam. That's said, okay? And that's an extra tefillah, which it's not said in Israel. It's a later institution. It's a later institution, and it's parallel to the tefillah that is said after Shemona Esrei on Shabbos, which is this bracha of Magen Avos, etc., etc. What's the basis of this? Why were they instituted? They were instituted for one reason. They used to daven outside of the city. The shul was not next door to a person's home, for example. It was quite far. People would have to walk, and it was in the forest. And people, if you'd finish davening, right, in the evening, what do? You go home. You have to get back home. Your kids, your wife, whatever it is. Yep, your spouse, whatever it is. People have to leave. So you leave. Now, the thing is, everyone's going to leave as a group, but there's one dude who davens a very long Shemona Esrei, okay? And they daven a little bit longer, and that person's going to be left alone, in the dark, walking back. And that's dangerous. So Chazal came along. This is a wild thing. We're so sensitive to extra brachos. Like over the top sensitive, right? I think I may have said something. I don't say it at all. They instituted an entire series of a bracha, but a very long bracha, in order to ensure that person who is taking a little bit extra time, either because they have a long Shemona Esrei, or because, and the post will say, the person came late. Right? No, we should throw rocks at them because they came late. No, not only not throwing rocks, we are adding to our tefillah to give that person a chance to finish at the same time as we do, so we could all leave at the same time, so that person will not be left by themselves. It's wild. So, and we keep it. Now, we don't daven in the middle of nowhere, right? It's an amazing thing. Again, I happen to like the Ashkenaz custom over here. When I'm like a little bit conscientious of it. But at Mariv, we have the Arizal says before you daven, to properly daven, you have to accept upon yourself what? If someone of a famous teacher says you have to accept upon yourself and the Arizals they write Arizal Siddur like you're right. Before I daven, I'm accepting upon myself the mitzvah of loving other people, because the only way we really have effective tefillah is if we see ourselves connected to everyone else, whether we're with people or not. I love everyone else, and then Hashem is going to accept my tefillos. And Mariv, by saying Baruch Hashem La'olam, if you pause for a split second and think about it, what we're doing is a fulfillment of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. To say that even the schlepper and even the annoying person or whatever is taking too long, I am thinking about them, I'm caring about them. It's essentially a fulfillment of V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, and to think about that before we daven, before we say Shemona Esrei. It's a beautiful institution. So it's amazing that despite the fact that nowadays there is absolutely no need for it, we keep it in order to ensure that we are thinking about the other people, the fact that there are other people around us, and again, just a beautiful tefillah because of that. But the bottom line is that the proof to bring from that tefillah really is not a real tefillah. In other words, if you're davening by yourself, you skip it. If you're, it's not something which is an obligation. Therefore, to bring a proof from there does not qualify. So the bottom line is, like we've spoken out until now, the bottom line halacha is that we do mention Al Hanisim in Rosh Chodesh. We do mention Shabbos on Yom Kippur. We do Haftorah is actually a big debate. You'll notice if you ever read the Haftorah or see in the Siddur, and whenever the Haftorah falls, whenever it's a special Haftorah on Shabbos, and it's also Rosh Chodesh, do you add a few psukim or not? It's a big machlokas based on this Gemara, because the Gemara is not so clear what the halacha is about that. So that's still left a little bit unresolved. Okay, we'll stop over here. Have a great day.